President and his advisors not talking, but that isn't making this any less of a political problem for the White House.
It isn't, and it isn't making the questions go away, Andrea, and we are keeping track. This is the fifth straight day that President Biden has ignored reporters' questions about this matter that has been looming over his administration. And, of course, the latest flashpoint is that Republicans are asking for the visitor logs from the president's Delaware home, one of two locations where classified documents were discovered. Both the Secret Service, the White House counsel's office saying, look, we don't have those logs. Let me read you a part of what the Secret Service spokesperson said, quote, "We don't independently maintain our own visitor logs because it's a private residence." We know that this is a growing political problem, though, Andrea, for the administration. We know that the president is feeling increasingly frustrated based on conversations with sources who are familiar with his thinking, in part because he sees this as a moment where his administration could draw a sharp distinction between him and his predecessor for all the reasons that you laid out. The two matters are different. They're both under investigation now by a special counsel, but the president, the White House, argues that there are some key differences, both in terms of the volume of classified documents and also, of course, former President Trump was asked to give those documents back and then his home was searched by the FBI. So the president feels as though that is getting missed in all of this. And again, a growing political problem here as the president inches closer to potentially announcing another run for office, Andrea.
And Barbara, let's talk about the law, not the politics for a moment, because can that really be separated, even though we know that the Attorney General says it is? Does this make it harder to indict Donald Trump for obstruction or other possible crimes involved with keeping the classified documents for more than a year, not turning them over, his lawyer not being, forthcoming on an affidavit? Does that make it harder?
So legally, no. I think that prosecutors compare cases with similarities and differences all the time. Sometimes there is the presence of criminal intent in the same kind of business transaction as another, and prosecutors are able to keep the two separate in their heads and charge those that have criminal aspects to them and decline charges in other kinds of cases. But I think you raise a very good point about the way this legal issue has become intertwined in politics. And I do think it's going to make it very important for whoever charges this case to be able to distinguish the two cases. Because one of the things prosecutors have to think about is litigation risk. If you file criminal charges, you want to believe that there is a high likelihood that you can obtain and sustain a conviction. And if there is public skepticism about the charge, that it is simply based on politics, then that risk goes up exponentially. But I think a way to distinguish the two cases still revolves around the idea of obstruction of justice. It appears that there may be evidence that Donald Trump obstructed justice when he failed to comply with the subpoena and lied by saying that all documents had been returned when there were still more than 20 boxes in his basement at Mar-a-Lago. That's very different from the case of Joe Biden, who also retained classified materials, but gave them up as soon as he discovered them, it appears, and did not make any effort to obstruct the investigation. So that's where the cases differ, and that's where prosecutors would make the difference in the legal case, and I think in the case, in the court of public opinion.
And Barbara, let me just follow up with you for a moment, because could there also be a very big distinction if, and this is a big if from the usher or other witnesses, they have any evidence that Donald Trump actually was involved in taking some of those classified documents, choosing what he wanted, for instance, the letter from Kim Jong-un, rather than what is being projected, at least, we don't know this, but from Joe Biden saying he was surprised, and they seemingly are trying to create a defense that it was actually the people who packed him and not anything that he was aware of.
Yeah, the facts matter, and that's why investigations occur, to find out what you can about how these documents ended up where they did in the first place. If they're simply swept up in the chaos of packaging at the end of an administration for either of the two men, then I think the fact that they simply have boxes in their homes probably is not enough for a crime. But if, as you say, the facts are different, that Donald Trump handpicked certain documents that he wanted to keep after he was president, after he no longer had a legal right to those things, then that brings with it a level of willfulness that is one of the aggravating factors that prosecutors look to when making a charging decision.
Jeff Mason, though, the politics are inescapable, especially with a new House majority. They're having a field day now demanding the logs, even though other presidents' homes are considered private, and they also don't have logs of visitors. They seem to be trying to imply something about Hunter Biden,
for sure,
having been at the House.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the biggest political weakness here. And you're talking about the differences between the legal aspect and the political aspect. The political aspect leaves a lot of vulnerabilities for this president and for this White House because it feeds into or gives Republicans an opportunity to talk about conspiracies, to raise questions, to lift up some of the things that have been dogging President Biden for a long time that may have absolutely nothing to do with these documents. But because they're not answering some of those questions or aren't able to, for legal reasons, it creates this political vacuum.
Ben Rhodes, you dealt with the chaos at the end of an administration and 8 years with President Obama and people packing things, and you dealt with classified documents every day as Deputy National Security Advisor. Could you give us some insights into how these things can get mixed in with other pieces of paper when those of us outside I've always thought that they're tracked individually, go into burn bags or only read in skiffs?
Well, I remember, packing up my office, and I think I was at the White House until like 5 in the morning, a couple of days before the inauguration. But the reality is these documents are well marked, and that's why they're well marked. They're cover sheets. Every page is stamped with a classification level. So for me, it was just a matter of dumping all those documents in burn bags. I think it's trickier for a president or vice president who obviously have far more documents in their offices, in their residences, than I did as a White House official. And so clearly what happened here is something went wrong in the process of packing up those documents. Documents got co-located, and they could have been co-located, by the way, at any time. It might have happened months before things were packed up. A memo gets put in the wrong place here. And I think the important thing to keep in mind in terms of the differences here, too, is the integrity of the classification system really matters. You want to send a message to people to take this seriously, to not take stuff where they shouldn't be, to not take documents that are meant to be in secure facilities outside of those secure facilities. And I think President Trump, in essentially ignoring a request to return these documents, was essentially challenging the basis of that entire system. The rules don't need to apply to me. Whereas with President Biden, clearly there was a mistake made, but the instinct was to say, no, I respect the integrity of the system. I'm going to give this stuff back. But yes, clearly mistakes were made in the packing up of those offices.